Hello, please. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. The mother of murdered Pat Tate has claimed that her son was no drugs baron and died trying to protect his friend targeted for a revenge killing. Pat, 37, of Gordon Road, Basildon, was one of the trio found shot dead in a Range Rover in Rettenden early on Thursday, December the 7th. They were believed to have been lured to their deaths by a rival gang, but his mother Marie, 56, said the 6'3", 18-stone heavyweight had only attended the risky undercover meeting to support his pal Tony Tucker. She is convinced Tony, 38, of High Road Fobbing, and the other victim Craig Rolfe, 26, of Calshot Avenue, Chafford 100, were taken out by drugs rivals in a revenge attack for the drugs death of Kevin Whitaker in November 1994. She is emphatic that her son was not involved in that. Chelmsford coroner Dr. Malcolm Weir recorded an open verdict into Kevin's death after his drugged body was found in a ditch in Dunton. But his parents always claimed he must have been murdered by being made to take an overdose. Kevin's father Bert said, quote, "We believe Rolfe and Tucker were involved, but nobody came forward to say how it happened. Tucker was definitely at the inquest and Craig Rolfe had a warrant served on him to attend. He said Rolfe denied at the inquest that he knew Kevin, but was shown phone bills proving that his number had been rung from Kevin's house." And he added, quote, "We heard there was a contract out on Rolfe and Tucker, but how and if they did this to Kevin, we don't know." The toxicologist told us he didn't know how it wasn't a murder verdict at the inquest because of the amount of lignocaine, one of the drugs involved. Kevin was anti-needles, he hated them. Somebody administered this, but we don't know how or why. Mrs. Tate alleged that Kevin was caught up in a deal with a Romford drugs gang involving £60,000 worth of cannabis, for which he would have been paid just £2,000. But she claimed Craig and Tony wanted to stop Kevin talking. She said they injected him with a substance nicknamed Special K, a paralysing drug used on horses. She said, quote, "This paralysed his body but not his brain. They followed it up with what they told him was a line of cocaine which completely finished him off. He was only used to smoking bits of cannabis." Mrs. Tate said Pat was in hospital at the time. Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker told him about it and thought it was funny. But Pat was in hospital after an attempt on his own life by someone else. He was shot while out on parole from an earlier prison sentence, and he forfeited that freedom after a nurse found a gun under his bed and he was jailed again. He had only been out of prison 5 weeks when he was killed. Mrs. Tate said, "People keep saying that he was a drugs baron, but he wasn't. He was no angel, but he wasn't one of the people that goes round to nightclubs selling e-tablets. Pat was warned about going to that meeting in Rettenden, but he went to protect Tony. Because he was such a big man, he thought that nothing could happen to him. He and Tony idolised each other." A total of 40 officers are currently working on the case to find the triple murderer. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who is leading the inquiry, said, "We would be interested to hear from Mrs. Tate if she has information she feels would be of use to our inquiries." The following newspaper article was from the 1st of March 1996 with the headline, "Drug War Alert." An all-out gang war to settle control of the drug trade in South Essex was the grim prospect portrayed by police bosses for TV viewers at the weekend. The dire warning came on Sunday's London weekend television programme London Tonight, which showed violence among the drug barons of South Essex spiralling out of control. Essex police have now confirmed that the battle against the drug trade has become their top priority. According to police, more murder and mutilation in answer to the assassination of Basildon gangsters Pat Tate, Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker at Rettenden last December, is expected soon. Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who is leading the inquiry into the Rettenden shooting, said, "When 3 people of this calibre are murdered, there will be no shortage of people wanting to take their place. Violent reprisals from the friends of the deceased or from someone close to one of those murdered must be expected." Also screened was the horrific tale of drugs, torture and extortion surrounding recently jailed Jason Vella and his Basildon and Tilbury-based gang. An Essex police spokesman said, quote, "The arrest of drug traffickers is one of our key objectives. We are holding a major conference on March the 20th with other agencies, including educationalists and the probation service, to see how we can tackle the drugs problem." The following newspaper article was from the 7th of March 1996 with the headline, "The Hit." They have a new parlour game in the Essex village of Rettenden, and no one plays it better than Peter Theobald and his wife Frances. Murder Mystery is a game of mental gymnastics, its aim to formulate a theory, necessarily incredible, to weave the few known facts into a complete account of what happened 300 yards from their living room. The Theobalds from Farming Stock were at it again the other night over tea and walnut cake. He wondered why there was so little mess when he made his discovery on an icy winter's morning. She was struggling to explain how they could have driven to the remote spot behind their White House farm during the evening rush hour as police supposed, and why nobody had seen them as they waited for several minutes before completing the right turn in their Range Rover. Quote, "Perhaps they were already dead," she suggested, returning to one of her favourite themes. There were 3 bodies, victims of a shotgun assassin as they sat in the lane. Craig Rolfe, 26, was in the driver's seat. His boss, Tony Tucker, 38, friend to the stars, was in the front passenger seat, and in the back was Tucker's boyhood friend, Pat Tate. It was a fearsome crime, except many locals thought good riddance to drugs rubbish. They were drug dealers, but none was Mr. Big, even in Essex. They were speculating at the spanking new police station in South Woodham Ferrers. It has a lovely new incident room, and as the officers moved out after investigating the death of teenager Leah Betts, it seemed only right Ivan Dibley and his squad of 40 should move in. The station was officially opened 3 weeks after their murder inquiry got underway. The forum for a classic detective story. Some detectives believed the gunman was in the Range Rover with his victims. His 3-shot pump-action 12-bore shotgun, a little sawn off perhaps, picked up at the murder spot as he clambered out to open a gate. Others think he stepped out of the shadows after the Range Rover's occupants were lured to Workhouse Lane, regular home to courting couples. Others still favour a hybrid. The gunman was indeed waiting, but the man who ordered the murders had hired a professional hitman and arrived with the others in the back seat, a trusted colleague or friend. They died in under 2 seconds, and only one, Tate, seemed to know anything about it. How much, as almost everything in this case, is conjecture. A post-mortem examination highlighted a combination in his bloodstream of heroin, cocaine and cannabis. He was, after all, an 18-stone bodybuilder. A room darkened as he entered it, one associate was to remark. There were, in the first few weeks, an array of flowers left at the scene, mysteriously dropped by unseen hands in the dead of night. One paid tribute to the man on the back seat, who took 2 shots to his head and 1 in the stomach. "A wonderful man," it read. "Poison did this to you." Nearly 3 months on, there are no more flowers. Ivan Dibley, 50, one of 3 detective superintendents in Essex, was on a day off on December the 7th last year. He was breakfasting at home in Chelmsford when the call came just before 8:30 a.m. He reacted calmly, going off to the shops to do his early morning chores before taking over the investigation. He had headed more than 25 murder investigations in the previous 5 years. It rankled that 2 remained unsolved. But 1995 had been a good year. He had cleared up 10 murders in as many months. He had never headed a triple murder inquiry before. It dawned on him that this, his biggest case, was to be his last. He was retiring at the end of April after 32 years in the force. Only 30 minutes had elapsed since Ken Jiggins, 47, arrived at Peter Theobald's door, ready to help his friend feed the 800 pheasants kept in fields at the 130-acre farm. Theobald ran a shooting range, and the birds had to be fed twice a day. Jiggins was a bricklayer, and the frost was too severe to work that day. They skipped tea, and Theobald started up the Land Rover, scraping thick ice from its windows. It had begun snowing about 4 p.m. the previous day and continued into the early hours when frost had set in. They drove across the field, maybe 300 yards, and turned left into Workhouse Lane. There, in front of a locked gate leading to an angler's carp pond and the shooting area, was a metallic blue Range Rover. Its windows, despite the ice, were clear, and the pair could see 2 men in the front seats. They looked asleep, and Jiggins jumped out to ask them to move aside. Theobald was wondering if they were poachers, when Jiggins, who had tapped on the driver's window, shouted out, "There are 2 dead men here." He used his mobile phone to alert the police, while Theobald went to check. As well as the 2 in the front, he saw another man dead in the back, slumped across the seat. He looked more closely at the driver, still with his hands on the steering wheel, and, he later learned, his foot on the brake. There was a round 2-inch entry wound behind his ear, exiting out of his mouth. Familiar with firearms, Theobald was astonished to learn that the men had been slain by a shotgun, and that each had 2 wounds to the head. There was some blood seeping from the Range Rover, but nothing like the mess he would have expected. His favoured murder mystery scenario was to posit a killer in the back seat, shooting the men in the front from 6 inches with the rifle pointing down. But that left his fellow players wondering what his backseat companion was doing as the shots were fired. Maybe he thought he was in on the hit, or perhaps he was too drugged to react. Rolfe, a father of a 7-year-old daughter, was the first to die, police believe. A small-time hood, he was the driver, and the automatic gear shift was still switched to drive. The ignition was off, but said Dibley he looked as if he had pulled up at a set of traffic lights. Alongside him was his boss Tucker, minder to ex-WBC super middleweight champion Nigel Benn. He ran a lucrative security agency for clubs around Essex and East London and pocketed maybe £1,500 a week. Like the others, he had a fine lifestyle, living in a £250,000 home and driving fancy cars. He was like scores in Essex in the drugs business, a wholesaler who never dirtied his hands. He was big in Basildon, but hardly serious enough to merit such special treatment. His bouncer business gave him the outlets, and Rolfe, who had a cocaine problem, was a trusted gopher, no more. Tate, who had a 2-year-old son, was out of prison for no more than 6 weeks when he died. He had a much more serious criminal record than the others, including convictions for drug offences and armed robbery. He had once escaped from the courthouse at Billericay, making off on a motorcycle driven by an accomplice. Heading for Spain, he made the mistake of visiting Gibraltar and was extradited back. He was out of prison on parole and enjoying a shave when the gunman came. He threw a brick through the window and as Tate reacted, fired once. It hit Tate in the arm and he was taken to hospital. Staff discovered his secret stash of drugs and his handgun beneath his pillow. Tate's licence was revoked and he was returned to prison. Tucker, a friend from childhood, looked after his second-hand car business. One man questioned over that attack was Stephen Ellis. He raced off to a new identity in the West Country in apparent fear of reprisal and took to wearing body armour. He popped up a few days after the triple murder with a suspiciously graphic account of how they died. The trio had been given a choice, death by a single shot or through hacking, bit by bit. Tucker and Tate had messed their trousers. Great tale, little of it true. When Tate had come out of prison, Tucker wanted to give him a place in his drugs organisation, more of a franchise operation than an independent outfit. But as even his mother admits, Tate was a liability. Tucker and Rolfe were hardly adverse to beating up those who crossed them, but Tate, a violent man driven crazy by drugs, was out of control. The night before he died, he telephoned the London pizza company at Basildon. He told Roger Ryle, 21, the manager, he wanted a specially made pizza with 4 different toppings on each quarter. Ryle was busy and he was annoyed at the caller's attitude. He hung up. Tate was there within minutes. He picked up the till, smashed it against a wall, he punched Ryle, then smashed his head into a glass plate on the sink. Ryle, like others crossed by the trio, declined to press charges. After the murders, the rumours flew. One suggestion was they were trying to muscle in on someone else's patch. Another had them heavily in debt. And a third indicated they had been double-crossed after hiring a £20,000 hitman to take out a rival drugs dealer. There was one claim that it was a revenge attack for Leah Bett's death, with Tucker probably the ultimate dealer, and another which made Dibley chuckle, quote, "There are members of the public who even think the police did it. Bollocks. None of the dead men's families is talking. They have a good idea." But they are afraid. Dibley, with a team of 15 detectives, says, quote, "The public aren't too happy either about so much time being spent on such lowlife. But my job isn't to moralise. The killers have to be caught. There is to be no tit for tat yet, and that has surprised me a little. But some intelligence indicates the families are keen to give us a chance to sort it out." He has 5 more weeks to solve the case. There is no concrete evidence to say whether the killer travelled in the 7-year-old Range Rover bought by Rolfe 2 weeks earlier or appeared at the scene. Nor is it certain whether he had an accomplice or a getaway car, nor whether he was a professional hitman. But Dibley has a best guess scenario. He knows the 3 men were planning to go for a meal that night with girlfriends to a Basildon restaurant. Kick-off was to be 8 p.m. A telephone call came in the late afternoon. Both Tucker and Tate were still holding their mobile phones when they died. But Dibley believes the call came in from a public telephone the trio used to circumvent itemised bills. It was someone they trusted, summoning them to a meeting. They didn't think they would be long. He has no idea why Workhouse Lane was the meeting place or whether it was familiar to them. Although quiet, it was far from deserted, but there is a pond nearby and often drug smugglers hid stashes underwater. None was armed when discovered, not even Tate, who went almost everywhere with a gun. Dibley believes it unlikely guns were taken from them, so they trusted whoever was behind the killings. The gunman didn't pick up the 8 spent cartridges. It was dark and would have taken too long. He fired off 3 shots quickly, killing Rolfe, then Tucker. They would have known nothing. Tate might have reacted and the first shot to hit him was probably the one through his abdomen. The gunman reloaded twice. Each was hit twice in the head, although probably already dead. Tate took an extra shot. Quote, "The fact that he reloaded twice when his victims were already dead means it was done in an act of vengeance," says Dibley. The motive was Tate. Increasingly out of control, Tucker had tried to give him a place in his drugs hierarchy. That, allied to Tate's behaviour, had infuriated others. Tucker and Rolfe, according to this version, were taken out incidentally, but police in Essex will shortly reopen their investigation into the death of Kevin Whitaker, 28, who died of an apparent overdose in November 1994. He was a drug courier, an associate of Rolfe. His parents and Tate's mother believe he was murdered over a drug debt. His killers, Tucker and Rolfe. Tate's mother, Marie, said her son told her about it when she visited him in hospital after he was shot. Whitaker, whose parents were horrified to discover his link with drugs, disappeared from their home on November 17th, 1994. He had brought round his 6-month-old son Lewis, but had gone out when Rolfe called him for the umpteenth time. Almost 30 hours later, police arrived on the Basildon doorstep of Bert and Joan Whitaker to tell them their son had been found, dumped by the roadside. That Whitaker had died from a drug overdose there was no doubt. Police, seeing needle marks on his right arm, assumed at first he was an addict. They believed his death might be suicide, and other drug users had moved his body, terrified the police might prosecute them for drugs offences. There was an inquest at Chelmsford a year ago. Rolfe called to give evidence, at first denied knowing Whitaker, then admitted he had called him when confronted with itemised phone bills. Quote, "We realised there was more to our son's death," said Joan Whitaker, 64, and then Mrs. Tate, after the deaths, claimed Tucker and Rolfe had injected Whitaker in the groin with a paralysing drug often used on horses, known as Special K. The victim is powerless but conscious. Whitaker was then injected with lignocaine and died. Mrs. Tate thinks Whitaker's friends avenged his death. Her son was the innocent party. But Whittaker was small fry, and although police now believe Rolfe and Tucker murdered him, they feel it had nothing to do with last December's events at Workhouse Lane. Dibley, who remains strangely bullish, has made one arrest. A 27-year-old decorator from South London was held in a joint operation with Scotland Yard and was charged with firearms offences. He is remanded in custody, and he said, quote, "We're not frustrated. You only get frustrated when there's no work to do, and there's plenty to be done. I'm happy with how our inquiry is proceeding, and I'm hopeful of arrest before I retire. It's how I'd want to end a 32-year career."